Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Happy to be joined again today by Josh Blank, research director for the Texas Politics Project. Josh, how are you this fine Trump trial morning? Actually, Trump indictment.
I was going to say it's not
Trump arraignment.
No, we're not
morning.
there yet. Let's not get ahead of ourselves.
No, well, I'm going to, we have to at least flag that this is happening since it's,
Yeah.
of some consequence.
I don't think the trial comes until the trench warfare period is over.
Right.
So
yes.
there's a lot of...
I went too fast with the alliteration. Yeah. So today, I'm still feeling...
Tantalizing Trump
I'm
trial.
still alliterating and feeling showy after the Taylor Swift experience Saturday night.
It's true. You've been impossible.
Right. Well, even more impossible than usual. Just shake it off, Josh.
There we go. Oh, good.
The pace of the legislative session in Austin here, getting back down to reality.
Right, okay.
Pace of the legislative session in Austin is continues to be pretty brisk, with committees still the center of most of the action, but floor activity really picking up in both chambers, as is appropriate for where we are. So I thought today, we'd highlight a few things that are going on, mainly the what's going on in the House this week, but a couple of other interesting things that have happened this week. Mm-hmm. And as I said at the beginning, it seems kind of impossible not to at least mention the major national political story dominating politics in the U.S. right now and getting a lot of international coverage.
Yeah,
and that's the arraignment of former President Trump in New York. Today, we're recording Tuesday morning, and everybody's, waiting with bated breath for him to show up, which is supposed to happen this afternoon. And I don't want to poke at that hornet's nest anymore for today.
Right.
Very likely we'll have the chance to come back to this topic. But do want to flag that if you're looking for information on views of Trump in Texas, we did a podcast on this a couple of weeks ago and compiled a ton of data in the run-up to his rally in Waco. At that time, you can find that in the blog section of the Texas Politics Project website, texaspolitics.utexas.edu. And if you're more of a DIY type, you can use the search engine on our website to find the Donald Trump tag or do a manual search, and you'll find hundreds of results going back to 2015.
I think I just noticed, the other day when I was looking at it, there are, 160 plus survey results depicted in that search engine.
And that's probably even a little light.
Yeah,
Right.
I think so. There's probably some other.
But yeah, there's a lot, and I guess I should say hundreds of. So there's about 160 or something like that in results, but there are then thousands of graphics.
Yeah, those are those are broken down by every conceivable demographic you might want to look at.
Right,
so.
And we pulled highlights out for that blog post, but there's also just a lot of raw material for you to go look at if you are so inclined or find it useless. Find it useful. But back in Texas, the big legislative event this week, I think, in terms of overall impact, is the House budget bill being debated on the floor this Thursday. Bill's 1,000 pages long, appropriately.
Yep.
After all, they have to cover 2 years.
Yeah.
And more than 380 amendments had been filed by the Monday morning deadline, and there's an amendment packet circulating that's still not posted on the website, but that's circulating in Capitol circles.
The dark net?
Yes, on the gray net. We'll link the amendment packet that is in circulation to the post for this podcast on the same Texas Politics Project website. So there'll be a blog post for this podcast if you found it elsewhere, and we'll put a link to that packet in there. But this raises the issue of what the spending priorities look like as the rubber meets the road in the legislature in the budget process. We'll just get the cliche out of the way now. It's the only bill the legislature has to pass.
Right.
And this bill came out of the Appropriations Committee on a pretty lopsided but party line vote, 23-3 for the biennial budget. A few highlights to set up what we're going to talk about in public opinion. So spends about $136.9 billion in general revenue, the budget itself being larger than that.
Right, that doesn't include federal dollars.
Yeah, given federal dollars, other things. Recommends an additional $5 billion for public schools, somewhat more funding for higher education, and that's, I believe, a difference with the Senate version. About $3 billion to boost mental health services, about $3.5 billion for cost of living adjustments for retired teachers, $5.3 billion from the surplus to lower property taxes, and then an additional $12 billion in school property tax cuts. And you add those two together for the bottom line property tax cut total. And then on border security spending, about $4.6 billion. Last I saw, identical to what was in the Senate. We've talked about this a bit. We'll talk about it more. Mm-hmm. Now, as the legislature was getting underway, or had just gotten underway in our February poll, we asked Texans about their views of spending in several general areas. And I looking at what's in there and what's been talked about, not to pat ourselves on the back too much, we did a pretty good job of covering the waterfront. Mm-hmm. And a couple of things that aren't being talked about that much. Well, it's good to have the data on those. So Josh, give us a sense of what the results were and how this looked compared to what we found.
Yeah, and I think it's important to sort of explain, what the question kind of looks like here. Essentially, we give people 12 broad policy, broad-ish, I would say, policy areas like, mental health services, K through 12 public education, border security, transportation, to kind of give you an idea. And then we ask whether or not, the voters think that the state is spending too much, too little, or about the right amount. Now, look, we don't think that people know how much the state is spending on any of these areas in any sort of concrete way. The idea of a question like this is to get a sense of what people think about, their perception of the state's commitment to these areas fiscally, right? And that's something that people do. People can say, again, we talk about Texas often as a low taxes, low services kind of state. And so ultimately people will have a perception of whether the state is invested in public ed or is invested in electric infrastructure or water infrastructure or not. They can also say, hey, I have no idea.
What I've always liked about this, this formulation is, it's both its strength and its weakness is that it's kind of in that area. It captures both people's kind of disposition, what they sort of have in their head about the current sense, but also gives us some indication of how they might respond to new information about this.
Exactly. And so, and I think that's the most important point here is that, when you see an area where, large majorities of voters and especially large majorities of majority party voters are saying the state is spending too little, that tells you or might explain why the legislature might then want to kick in some more money so that when they go back around to the other, sort of part of Texas politics, then the 2-year campaign cycle after the legislative cycle, they can say, and we made historic investments in X.
Right.
Y, Z. So what does it look like? Well, we asked about 12 different areas, and a majority of registered voters said the state was spending too little in 5 of those 12 areas, so just under half. Those included children in the state's care, unsurprisingly, 50% said the state was spending too little, water infrastructure, 51%, healthcare, 52%, electric infrastructure, 56%, and then mental health services was 60%. So the highest of all of those issues, that was the area where Texans thought the state should be spending more. The view among Democrats was that there was too little spending in most areas, except for border security and the penal system. And that's, I think aligns with Democratic ideology and on just general Democratic views about state commitment to social services.
In a rough sense, I remember, when we first saw these results, you kind of look at it and go, yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. Well, and you want that. We call that internal consistency,
yes.
Right? So among Republicans, only one policy area saw a majority that said the state was spending too little. This was border security.
I said, well, I wanted to give everybody a second to guess.
Sorry, I went too fast. And
You'll never guess what it was.
And we've asked about border security spending in isolation. And I mean, one of the interesting things just to point out is that as the state has ramped up its border security spending in the last few years, the share of Republicans who say the state is spending too little has also increased. So actually, there's not a lot of responsiveness on this. And in a lot of ways, this is why there's not a lot of debate about this. There's no difference in the House and Senate budgets because you know what? They're going to spend it.
Right. One of those rare moments where you're not really hearing a lot about border security because the consensus among the majority party is so firm. And and as we've talked about in the podcast before, it's a good issue for Republicans in terms of where Democrats are as a group on border security.
Yeah, it's certainly an issue in which they have a lot of advantages, which we've talked about. Something that's kind of important here, and I'll talk a little bit more of the main areas, but it's interesting in that when we used to ask about legislative priorities in prior sessions, and I would say some of this was circumstantial. When you think about 2011, 2013, think about sort of shifts in the last decade over public opinion. The presence of a significant minority, but a significant share of Republicans who really emphasize the importance of limiting state spending, keeping government small as the priority.
And as a thing unto itself.
Unto itself, that has really kind of disappeared.
Yeah.
I mean, there's not a lot of fiscal conservatism floating around out there. And so, and just to say, even though there are very few, again, I think what you find is the plurality position among most Republicans across most spending areas that the state's spending about the right amount.
Yeah.
It's not that there's necessarily a call to decrease spending dramatically in a lot of areas, nor to increase spending dramatically in a lot of areas. There's just generally kind of a status quo, sense, which is, it's kind of interesting to me. This is, just fundamentally, like, the budget does keep going up. The state keeps growing. The spending keeps growing. In some ways, you can look at some policies and say government is growing here. But anyway, that's another podcast. Maybe.
I was just going to say, I mean, it's something that's popped up in a few areas, and a few different domains, not just policy areas, but a few different domains. This notion of, what is the accumulated view of the status quo among the party in power and their partisans?
Yeah.
At the popular level, after a couple of decades of running the show. And I think we probably could string a bunch of stuff together on that would be really interesting.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, right now, I would say, what you can say is that if in the last, the last part of the last decade, and part of this just dating myself kind of when I started looking at this stuff closely, but if you start thinking about, the Tea Party wave and moving in, there's been, probably, a relative shift from this focus on, again, limiting state spending to this sort of just, kind of status, or I would say, to limiting spending by local governments. I mean, that's actually where I think the shift kind of happened. So, that happened again.
Well, you can imagine this in like the broad scope section of a history or a textbook or something. It's I'm sort of thinking about your notion of like how long you've been watching, but you think about like the paragraph in the section about the last, about the party shift.
Right.
It takes a while for you to like shake off the sense that you're undoing what came before you.
Yeah, that's right. That makes sense.
Right, at least among, in the fat part of the distribution.
Yeah, there's lots of waste, fraud, and abuse to stamp out and to cut when you just take power. But once you've been in power for a decade, a little bit more difficult.
And that transfers to a bunch of other policy areas, right? I think, it's like,
okay,
we've, you can only start talking about having to really change the status quo for so long when you're implicated in the status quo.
Yeah, exactly. So, except for border, so setting that aside, except for border security, children in the state's care and mental health were the only other areas where not a majority, but a plurality of Republicans said, the state is not spending enough. In each of the other 9 areas we looked at, the plurality position was the state is spending enough, about the right amount. And so, to me, again, we kind of, this is sort of one of the themes of this podcast, this session, maybe one of the themes of the session, but, we'll kind of come back to this, I'm sure. But, this creates a lot of space again. I think, once you kind of take care of that border security spending and say, we did that, at that point, not only is there not, a lot of calls for big shifts in spending either way, but also, and I think we're acknowledging this in the way we write this question, it's also just not terribly salient to people. You know?
And
difficult to understand too.
Yeah, and the missing piece here, I think a little bit, not missing, but the other shoe dropping here is the item when we did ask people about taxation.
Right.
And by far the widest, the item, the tax, the state tax, with the widest reported impact was the property tax, and that is right now where most of the, it's not spending, but most of the allocation of this budget surplus, if you think about it that way, is going right now.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely.
So, so I think that, as you look at that, I mean, this budget, as we're, we're focused on the House budget, but the Senate budget, there's going to be fights on this. There's going to be a big fight over there's already a big fight going on over how they're going to execute the property tax. But, you look at these numbers, you look at the Republican numbers, but even for that matter, where Democrats are to some degree, and you do see a reasonable degree of alignment here, certainly with Republican attitudes, even allowing for the slack that you're talking about. In other words, the space for the legislature to lead rather than follow, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's one of those interesting things, going into the session, there's so much focus on, what they were going to do with the budget surplus. I think the politics, very quickly, the public politics very quickly showed that most of that was going to be focused on property tax reduction. And I think you could say, sure, I mean, again, which dollar goes where is kind of, sometimes real and sometimes art, but
Yeah.
But the other side of this too is, I just make this point again about, I think public response, if you were to go to any, your modal voter just and say, hey, the House is going to spend $3.6 billion on X and $4.8 billion on Y and $10 billion on Z, honestly, that doesn't mean anything to most people. Because you'd say to them, hey, how, if you could ask that same, and that person, you say, what do you think about this? And say, hey, by the way, how big is the Texas budget? And you know what? Almost nobody will have any sense of the size of the Texas budget, how much people are spending, whether that's a lot of money, whether that's a little, and both in terms of the overall budget, but also in terms of the need. I was talking to a group the other week, and I kind of have to say as a caveat, I don't work at the LBJ school and I'm not an economist.
Right.
Is a $3 billion increase in whatever this space is that a lot?
Right.
Is that something that does that even
Are you saying, do you know if it's too much, too little, or the right amount?
And my answer is I have no idea.
I don't know.
Which is, well, hey, listen, that's the problem with expertise in some ways, right? You have to be honest about these, or you should be honest about these things. But I mean, part of it is look, is this a lot in terms of the state's needs? Does this meet growing needs? Does this meet changes because of inflation? And honestly, in a lot of these spaces, I have no idea, and I definitely know how much the budget is, and I know how much these numbers are. So then when you go to someone, you say, you don't know how much the budget is, you don't know what they used to be spending on this. It's just a different ballgame. And so I think, it's one of those things at this point. The broad takeaway from my perspective, though, is, there was this huge budget surplus, but there wasn't some big, obvious, direct clamor for some kind of clear spending. And to the extent that property taxes ended up sucking up all of that, I don't know if that's following or leading, I mean, to your point.
Yeah. The arrows.
Yeah.
I think one other thing before we move on a little bit, I think it's, in a way, it's almost a good transition is that, two things lurking in that data, and we talked about this at the beginning, and it's playing out in the legislature, I think, in an interesting way, are these infrastructure issues.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a lot of support in those numbers you read for particularly water infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
Electric is a thing on in and of itself and on its own. I'm going to set that aside for the moment.
That's a tricky one.
But for water and to a lesser degree, but still there, transportation.
Mm-hmm.
And, there are pretty substantial structural moves quietly moving their way through the system to develop, to increase sort of funding for water and transportation infrastructure. And it's going to be interesting to watch those and see if they continue to move and if ultimately some of that money is put there. It's the kind of thing that I think that the public is, for all the reasons you were just discussing, unlikely to be highly salient to the public, but really having to jockey for position and doing maybe a little better than I would have expected 6 or 8 months ago.
Yeah.
But, we've talked about it in here a lot. We began to hear murmurs about this, in the fall and certainly right after the election. And some of these things are moving forward. And I think they are, I think the people that are interested in those issues are doing a pretty good job so far of moving legislation through at about the right level of putting their, sticking their heads above the hedges.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that's one of those things where that's sort of I would broadly almost classify that into, that infrastructure piece. It fits in the economic development bucket,
absolutely.
In a way that, and for voters, it's one of those things, I think, it's impossible. You can't deny the growth in the state. If you live anywhere near any urban center, bar none, right? There are issues going on with respect to transportation. There are water issues going on everywhere in the state right now. And electricity obviously is its own thing, but it's definitely, it's more salient than we would expect. But I also don't think that voters are necessarily calling for big, multi-decade infrastructure investments until there's a problem. But the problem is that when there's a problem, then you start the process that's going to take a decade plus to complete. So that's too late.
Right.
And this requires a little bit more forethought and kind of future-oriented thinking on the part of the legislature. It's honestly, hey, I don't know. I watch politics a lot. It's pretty rare to see legislators of any body anywhere thinking beyond the next election cycle.
Right.
But there's a lot of exposure with something like this. So I think on the one hand, you can kind of see that bubbling up down there, especially if you're Republicans in a more competitive state, worrying about, if the trip to the office when it happens takes an hour and a half, what used to take 20, like that's a problem.
It's a non-glorious issue.
It's a quality of life
we were involved in that research project a couple of years ago in which we talked to a lot of legislators in Texas and elsewhere. And that was one of the common themes was that, you're kind of doing the Lord's work here because everything takes a long time. It's complicated. There's no short-term political payoff in most cases. And so most people don't really want to mess with it. And there are a lot of other cross currents. For example, as we're seeing right now, not to comment on the virtues of the plan or not, but the implementation of the Project Connect thing in Austin, project in Austin, the attempted involvement of the legislature in that right now, et cetera. So, So, let's look at, a few other things going on while we still have a little bit of time. And I guess, we had talked about this as sort of a check-in post-budget in terms of, pegging this to some of the things that are going on. A couple of observations. As expected, Lieutenant Governor Patrick continues to dominate the Senate. But there was an interesting kind of blip in that just yesterday, as we were recording this on Tuesday. And so when the senators were on the floor to pass some bills on Monday, about an hour and a half in, they went back to a bill that had passed, a very controversial bill that had passed on second reading the previous week. And most of our listeners will know this, but just to clear, if you just happen to stumble into this and you're
still listening,
and you're still listening, second reading is really the one that matters of the 3 times a bill has to be read. And this was SB 14, the very controversial bill, at least among some people, authored by Senator Donna Campbell, that would essentially prohibit most gender-affirming medical care in Texas.
Right.
Now, this bill, as I said, had been passed with some debate last week. Now, after the Senate had been in for a while, yesterday there was a motion by Senator Brian Hughes, who is sort of one of the major lieutenants of the lieutenant governor.
Yep.
Lieutenant governor's lieutenant. I should have thought about phrasing that differently maybe. But he moved to suspend the rules so they could reconsider the passage of SB 14. And the point here was to reconsider an amendment that had been added to the bill, and that amendment in its initial second reading, that amendment had been worked out with the House author, State Representative Tom Oliverson. And it's interesting to note here, both Senator Campbell and State Representative Oliverson are doctors. And that amendment would have exempted children that were already receiving gender-affirming medical treatment like puberty blockers or hormone therapy medications. It would have kind of grandparented them in as an exception to the prohibitions in the bill. Now, that amendment was originally passed without objection.
Full stop, just no objection.
Right. Well, and Senator Campbell then, having had the rules suspended by the motion of Senator Hughes and the quick cooperation and acceding of the lieutenant governor who was presiding at the time and the parliamentarian. She now wanted a do-over on that amendment, essentially. A couple of Democrats rose to ask her some questions about this. Now, I would note that nobody objected to the motion, which I didn't quite understand, but I'll have to ask some people about that some more. I think they missed an opportunity, frankly. But a couple of Democrats then rose to try to find out from Senator Campbell why she wanted to roll back the amendment. So we've got a brief excerpt of an exchange between Senator Campbell and Democratic Senator Jose Menendez. So let's roll that clip, and then we'll talk about it on the other side.
What is the policy decision to remove the amendment today?
The actual amendment that I put on 14, or are you talking about the date from December?
The amendment that would allow the children who are currently under the care of a doctor to continue to finish their care.
The amendment was not discussed in committee, and there were so many questions that have been brought up since the amendment was put on that out of respect for the body, I'm going to just take it down. Ask that it be taken down.
But no one objected to your amendment when we adopted the amendment. So what do you mean by respect?
You didn't vote for the amendment.
No, there was no objection. The president said, is there objection? Without objection, amendment's adopted. So no one objected to the amendment. So I don't understand where we're lacking respect for the body.
I know there have been so many questions that have come up. There was no discussion regarding the amendment I was going to put on in committee. And truly, out of respect for everyone, I am going to ask for that it just be removed. I want to withdraw it. Remove it.
Okay.
Now, what Senator Campbell isn't saying, and I think what both Senator Menendez and then in a subsequent exchange, Senator Nathan Johnson, another Democrat, seemed to be trying to get her to admit, pretty notably, if painfully, without any success, is that the amendment had been heavily criticized in the intervening days by, the most conservative groups and some, opinion leaders of those groups, including the state GOP chairman, former House backbencher Matt Rinaldi, on Twitter and certainly, I'm sure, in feedback to their office. And you can find Chairman Rinaldi's tweets if you're so inclined. It had the usual kind of language describing gender-affirming treatment as castration and mutilation, etc.
And child abuse.
Child abuse, and then later on, after this was passed, claimed that it wasn't, anybody bowing to pressure from anyone. They were just doing the right thing, etc. It was a very awkward moment, though, and one that I thought the lieutenant governor, I would say, was not enjoying much. And I'll that's a judgment call.
Sure.
You can find the clip, and if you didn't see it, and check me on this. As the parliamentarian walked him through the maneuvers, Lieutenant Governor was very, let's say, brisk in getting through the sequence of motions to strip the amendment. And to also move up the effective date of the bill. That's part of what that some of that redirection and misdirection going on is that in stripping off the bill, in stripping off the amendment that was being discussed, part of that amendment had also moved up the effective date of the legislation.
Right.
And there was a real effort, I think, to get the whole thing behind them and the bill back on track. Now, I don't think this is proof positive that, Lieutenant Governor is slipping or something.
Right.
But something had clearly gone wrong there and gone amiss, and it did raise the question of the relationship between what many people perceive as one of the important roots of the Lieutenant Governor's power, which is the fact that, he is ultimately compared to the other members of the Big Three, Lieutenant Governor is kind of the party activist guy, you know. He's their avatar, if you will. And so it was a very interesting moment, interesting in terms of this theme we talked about, but also interesting in terms of, the difference between what's going on in the House and what's going on in the Senate.
Yeah.
And their institutional design, of course, but.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's just another, it's just another great example. I mean, just imagine, had this happened in the House, how much more difficult it would have been to kind of turn back the clock, go back, undo what they did, and come out. But it's also, just as an observer of these things, it just in and of itself, things like the institutional dynamics, it's just a really, again, say what you want about where the pressure came from or who is doing what or respect for whom. It was a pretty remarkable instance and a really naked one in which, essentially in real time, almost in real time, you could see the control of, the most far right elements or even some of the dissident elements of the party essentially coming in and tweaking the legislation. And I mean, importantly, not even legislation that the senators had all agreed to, even if by silence, but an amendment that had been agreed on between the senators and an important House member carrying the same bill who had defended the amendments, who now is kind of being left out to dry, right?
Yeah, well, and I think that really, I mean, it underlines the degree to which, it underlines a lot of different things. I mean, I don't want to be overly repetitive here, but yeah, I mean, I think that it was a real moment. And look, to be fair, and I'm sure that listeners who have been watching this for a long time will say, "Hey, look, it became kind of a joke that the House would turn back the clock, or hey, back up, members, during the Strauss." During the heyday of the Strauss speakership, when there were big fights going on, where Strauss was besieged. One day it would be Trey Martinez Fisher and the Democrats pushing them on procedure. Yeah. Another day it would be the Tea Party guys. And so look, part of skillful leadership in these chambers is being able to, shall we say, take full advantage of the flexibility of the rules. Mm-hmm. And, understanding when and where you can stretch them and under what circumstances. But, this was still, because of the degree to which this had seemed worked out the week before and the degree to which this hasn't been happening much in the Senate in particular, it was, it was an interesting moment. I mean, it's not a political earthquake, but I think, it'll be one of the moments, I'll remember about this session. Right?
Yeah, for sure.
And in a more practical way, the question now on the issue is you kind of flagged, Josh, how's the House going to respond? I mean, as you kind of said, State Rep Oliverson had been very publicly supportive of the bill with this grandparenting amendment in a pretty public way. And in the way of both the rivalries and the tensions that are baked into the House and the Senate, but also the personal piece of this, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens as this bill moves through on something that, again, pretty obviously some very activated elements of the coalition are paying attention to. And we should flag, there's very good coverage of this from, not surprisingly, Lauren McGaughy of the Dallas Morning News, who's been on this beat really effectively and consistently for a while now, and also Taylor Goldenstein in the Houston Chronicle. And the McGaughy captures the blow-by-blow very well. The Chronicle did an interesting thing, and I don't know, it may be different now, but as of yesterday afternoon, they had posted the update on this on top of the previous story in the Chronicle about how the subtext of which was, well, reasonable minds kind of prevailed, at least in this grandfathering clause.
Right.
So it's almost like, they were, it's like, oh, okay, we were giving people the benefit of the doubt, and then it kind of didn't work out. So, I would look at both of those.
Yeah.
Now, so another interesting thing going on this week that I think, we've also talked about in here, and again, this is one of those issues that's not, galactically earth-shaking, but it's gotten a lot of attention inside the building and inside Austin because of the resources that have gone into this and the long-term nature of the policy issue, and that's, of course, gambling and gaming. And the two big gaming bills that are out there in the House, the Chairman Leach's bill on online sports betting and the big Charlie Geren omnibus bill on casino gambling, both of those moved out of committee with provisions that will require supermajorities to pass for proposed constitutional amendments. Sure. And so that was, kind of big news in the community. That's as far as these bills have gotten after several years of trying and many millions invested and, pools built and stuff in the lobby. Pools built, trips taken.
Right.
But over in the Senate, Lieutenant Governor's still not on board. To circle back to, where the lieutenant governor is on things. Mm-hmm. And a lot of talk about this, of course. I think we even mentioned it last week in passing, kind of in the podcast, or maybe the week before. But, the lieutenant governor, has made it clear recently that he's still not on board. But he did so in a way that, again, kind of circles back and helps illustrate kind of what the dynamic we're seeing. And again, differences between the House dynamic, the Senate dynamic. Well, we'll talk about it more on the other side. We're going to play an excerpt from an interview that the lieutenant governor did with conservative radio host and really, guys become one of the master signal relayers in the information ecosystem in Republican Texas, and that's Mark Davis. And this was really the governor saying, I'm not having any of it. So let's roll those clips. And what you're going to hear before we roll are, just to, to be fair, two separate clips that we've just combined in the same conversation. I don't think we're misrepresenting anything, but I just don't want you to think it's just one clip. So let's roll those.
Unless I have 15, 16 Republicans, meaning it's a Republican-driven bill because we're in a Republican-driven state led by conservative Republicans, I'm not bringing a bill to the floor. I need to have consensus by the Republicans. Otherwise, it's a bill that the Democrats are passing. We don't do that in the Senate.
Says a lot. And this is, again, not news in terms of the general orientation.
Right.
The Lieutenant Governor made a point of appointing only one Democratic committee chair, and saying that would be it.
Circumstantial. Yeah.
Senator John Whitmire, which, and this had a fairly natural expiration date as chairs go. Not talking about Senator Whitmire personally. So I thought this was interesting in a lot of ways. Before we go on, I want to just give a hat tip for that clip. That was from coverage by Monica Madden, the Capitol correspondent for KXAN here in Austin. She tracked that clip down from the Mark Davis show for a story that she did on KXAN over the weekend, and you can find that on their website. But we talked about the gambling, how the lieutenant governor isn't into it pretty clearly, and public opinion is still a little tough for the gambling advocates, right?
Yeah, when we asked about whether gambling laws in Texas should be made more strict, less strict, or just basically left alone, overall, the energy was a little bit on making it less strict. A plurality, 39% said make it less strict, 25% said the status quo, 20% 1-4 said make it more 1-5 said make it more strict. Among Republicans, it was pretty similar actually to the statewide numbers overall. In fact, it was almost identical. But when we look at the people who say that they're extremely conservative, 60% would either leave the status quo or make those laws more strict. And similar numbers of people again, we've actually written about this a long time ago in the past, but these numbers actually still kind of come up again. When we look at people with strong religious identifications in Texas who almost entirely identify with the Republican Party, they hold views similar to the extremely conservative Texans who say essentially either leave those laws alone or make them more strict. And so given that you kind of look at those groups who really dominate, especially Republican primaries, you have a little bit less than a third who want to see gambling laws loosened. And then to read beyond the data here, honestly, and just saying I'm reading beyond the data, probably not a central issue for a lot of those people. It's probably not likely that a lot of very conservative voters who want to see the voting law or the gambling laws made less strict, this is probably not more important to them than immigration and the border. It's not more important than, property tax cuts. And so, in some ways, I think, without some sort of groundswell and again, attitudes that look like this, there's not really much reason for the lieutenant governor to kind of, use his own capital to push this issue.
It's still a stretch. And I think this is one of those issues where, look, it's easy to be cynical is too strong a word, but I'll just say cynical. It's easy to be cynical
skeptical or cynical
about the politics of this and decision-making by the lieutenant governor and other leaders. But I think it is fair if you look at things, if you look at gambling, you look at cannabis, and you look at the way that the lieutenant governor is a pretty hard no on both of those policy areas, despite a lot of cross currents. I do think it's fair to say that the lieutenant governor is, with a lot of complications, a relatively, organic expression of that part of the Republican base.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And so, there is a bit of his own impulses here that are reinforcing the politics.
I think it's notable going back to when he ran for that position. And I remember the debate with him and Dewhurst, and I want to say it was Staples and Patterson, right? And I remember when the abortion issue came up, and there was a moment where, Patrick basically went out in front and said, I'm down for banning abortion basically in all circumstances.
Yeah.
And I remember, you look at that debate stage and they all kind of looked at each other and there was a pause for a second. And then, it's kind of like, me too, and I think that's kind of, and the thing, there's some issues, especially again, that sort of organic, real depths of conservatism in the state that, are just, it's his home base.
Yeah.
And I think, that plus the other piece of it, what's interesting about the clip before that about it is, it's interesting to imagine that, if he had 10 Republican senators and 8 Democrats, that's just a no-go.
Yeah. And he's just not going to do, he is made a pretty strong decision, I think, that he's sticking with about how he wants the Senate to run and how he thinks it should run. Yeah. And it is, at odds with, what we have thought about traditionally and what people have often trumpeted as what makes the Texas legislature different. Yeah. In terms of compromise and cooperation, and everybody's kind of chummy about it. And this is where, as a communicator and as somebody who's spent, who's very good at managing his public presentation of self. You connect that to sort of the previous clip and what was happening there. If you go and you watch that longer, the longer debate over the Campbell bill and all of the, the shifting that went on and the replaying and the kind of, rebooting of that bill yesterday, the underlying mood of the Senate is just palpable.
What do you mean?
In that. And what I mean is, both the Democrats that spoke up against that, pretty dispirited. Yeah. I mean, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way. No. But, you can see them questioning Senator Campbell.
You've watched a lot of episodes of this.
Yes, knowing that she's not going to really answer their question in a very direct way, which she does not do. Right. But they also, baked in is the knowledge that they're probably not going to affect the trajectory of this thing.
I mean, it goes back to exactly what you said, which was, odd in that scenario not to object to the motion at the beginning, even just to kind of have that conversation, right? But again, in Dan Patrick said it, I don't know if that's really what you want to do.
And so, so these two things, obviously we picked out this, the nice thing about, to me, in picking out these two episodes, and there's lots of stuff going on right now. We could have picked out a lot of things, but is that it really, these things, I think, together kind of capture the dynamic between the two chambers. We haven't talked about Dade Phelan, but, lurking in here is the differences between the way Phelan is running the House. We've talked about the very different nature of his priorities, the bill sponsors on his list of priorities, the priorities of the lieutenant governor, and how that is all playing out. A lot of this is happening, more or less as expected. Yeah. That doesn't mean that we know how things are going to turn out. There's a lot of uncertainty in this. But it's an interesting week for the pattern to really be settling in as again, things are getting much more serious and the pace is picking up.
And hearing you talking about that, it really does encapsulate, this sort of, an interesting element between the last session and this session, right? In the sense that the last session was so conservative and so many things were passed, and yet there was still a certain amount of discontent. And you can see that in the Republican Party platform here. You can see that in the elevation of Matt Rinaldi as chair of the Republican Party and the way that he has approached that job. Yeah. Right. But in some ways, if I were to sort of do a shorthand for like, well, what, if someone, especially like a reporter from out says, what are they upset about? And they being, sort of Republican voters, especially Republican primary voters. And the answer that I would give is that, I think where the upset comes from within the activist corners of the party is this view that they've got a majority in the Senate, a supermajority, as they define it each time. Yeah. They've got the lieutenant governor. They've got the governor. They've got the Speaker of the House. They have a majority of members. Therefore, they should be able to pass everything they want. They should not have to touch anything they don't want. Now, the problem, okay, and I think the lieutenant governor has taken that on, but the problem is kind of, as we were kind of
talking. He gets to use it as a stick.
He gets to use it as a stick, but I think the problem also is, it kind of actually goes back to somewhat where we start, which is, and something I say to a lot of people too, the legislature is going to have about 5,000 bills floating around out there. They'll pass about 1,000. I'm not talking about, the joint resolutions and stuff like that. And maybe 20 bills or their 20 bills and their companions might like pique public salience a little bit. People might be kind of aware that something's going on, right? And when we're talking about this issue of like we should be able to pass everything we want, it's not about like what do we want? Like water infrastructure. No, that's not it. It's like no, we want to make sure that there's no transition related care. We want to make sure that there's a voucher program, whatever that manifests itself as, and some of that's going to be leading, some of that's following. It depends, right? But there's sort of that you take sort of the Campbell piece on that bill, and then you have the GOP chair kind of saying, "Hey, you guys messed up. You better fix that," and then they quickly go and fix it in the Senate. The House is kind of left holding the bag, saying, "WTF?" right? And then you've got the lieutenant governor on the Mark Davis show saying, yeah, look, if I don't, look, the only bills that are going to pass are going to have 16 to 19 Republican votes.
Yeah. He said 15 or 16, but yeah.
It's like, and that kind of, that is, again, to say the fact that like this is Dan Patrick's home ideologically, but also this is something that he is manifesting. And the truth is, whether the House follows suit or not, it actually doesn't really matter for Dan Patrick, right? If the House doesn't follow through on all this stuff,
he'll kick him around, which he's happy to do.
He's happy to raise money off of. He's happy to get in their business. He's probably happy to use it as a justification for another term to get done what he hasn't gotten done yet.
And then, and if they do pass it and they do have to fold on it, then he claims leadership, and either way.
Thank God he was there, right?
So yes. So I think that what really comes out of this is a good setup for what we're going to see in the House on Thursday, and how that's going to be we're going to learn some things, I think, in this budget debate as we see how some of these amendments are dealt with and what they look like, and how that day goes, right? And who, what the win-loss kind of record looks like on some of those amendments, and what that budget bill looks like as it goes to the Senate. So with that, thanks to Josh for being here, helping gather data for this. Thanks, as always, to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin for processing those clips at the last minute and generally giving us excellent production support. Data we talked about can be found, as always, at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.